Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating contradiction at the very heart of one of the world's most talked about economies. We're going to look way past those flashy macroeconomic headlines you see on the news, and we're going to uncover the actual structural engine running India's economy. By decoding the data, we're going to bridge that massive gap between global economic metrics and the very real, everyday financial reality that you actually feel in your wallet. Because honestly, on paper, India is celebrated as the fastest growing major economy in the world. I mean, the headlines are absolutely everywhere, right? And yet, for the vast majority of the salaried middle class, the everyday reality just feels entirely different. Your daily expenses are skyrocketing, and your purchasing power probably feels totally squeezed. So, what exactly is going on here? What is causing this massive disconnect between the nation's glowing balance sheet and your personal bank account? To figure that out, we're going to break this explainer down into four clear parts. We'll start with the gold and rupee crisis. Then we'll look at the ground reality of domestic manufacturing. After that, we'll unpack the deeply flawed way inflation is measured. And finally, we'll see how all of this culminates in a massive real estate trap. All right, let's jump straight into part one, the gold and rupee crisis, the capital drain. We have to start with our first major structural issue, which is a massive, continuous drain on the national currency, driven largely by an obsession with a single precious metal. The sheer scale of the trade imbalance here is just staggering. Think about this. India imports a whopping 800 tons of gold every single year, while domestically producing basically just 1 ton. That's it, 1 ton. This is exactly why you occasionally see the government practically pleading with citizens to stop buying so much gold. Because every single time gold is purchased from abroad, it has to be paid for in US dollars. So this creates a relentless, massive outflow of capital straight out of the Indian economy, putting immense, heavy pressure on the local currency. Now, you might be thinking, wait, doesn't a weaker currency actually help an economy by boosting its exports? Well, sure, that is textbook economics. But let's look at the actual reality on the ground. Over the last 14 years, the rupee has depreciated by over 60%. But during that exact same time frame, exports actually dropped from 25% of the GDP to just 21%. So unlike countries like Vietnam, which methodically devalue their currency while managing to grow exports by 14% annually, India's currency devaluation is fundamentally just not translating into an export boom. And because of this heavy, continuous reliance on importing goods without a matching rise in exports, experts who crunch this data have presented a pretty stark long-term projection. Based on the current trajectory, they predict the rupee could eventually hit 150 to the dollar. Now, this isn't meant to spark panic or anything, but it really highlights the undeniable mathematical reality of the current trade structure. So the big question is, why aren't exports growing? Well, that brings us to part two, the manufacturing reality, systemic costs. Let's take a hard look at what's actually happening right on the factory floor. The thing is, a weak currency only gives you an advantage if you actually manufacture your products entirely at home. Let's take pharmaceuticals as a prime example. India is famously known all over the globe as the pharmacy of the world. But here's the catch. Roughly 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are the essential raw materials needed to actually make these medicines, are imported directly from China. So, when the rupee weakens, importing those raw materials instantly becomes more expensive, and that completely wipes out any competitive edge you might have had when exporting the final finished medicine. And it's not just a reliance on foreign parts that's the problem. Domestic manufacturing faces massive baked-in systemic costs. Take electricity, for instance. The system relies heavily on cross-subsidization. So to provide cheap or even free electricity to households and farmers, the rates for commercial and industrial businesses are jacked up significantly. Throw in the heavy taxes on fuel, like the diesel used for logistics, which don't even offer full tax input credits to manufacturers. All these systemic costs make producing everyday goods locally way more expensive than just importing them. Furthermore, there is a deep structural inequality in how manufacturing is actually incentivized. Huge conglomerates that are making multi-billion-dollar investments can often swoop in and negotiate these incredible tailored packages. We're talking up to 110% in state GST refunds and total, complete exemptions on electricity duties. Meanwhile, an average small business owner trying to set up a modest 40-person unit, they get absolutely none of those advantages. The playing field is heavily, heavily skewed, and that effectively stifles the broader base of domestic production. Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's move away from the factory floor and look directly at your wallet in part 3, the flawed inflation metric, the CPI disconnect. We really need to talk about why the official inflation rate constantly feels like a complete myth to the average earner.
To really understand this, we have to look closely at the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. The government essentially uses this index to boil down the rising cost of living into one single percentage number. They track a basket of roughly 299 specific items and assign them different weights based on what they think an average citizen consumes.
But here is the massive catch. The weightings for this index were largely set way back around 2011, and incredibly, 46% of the entire index's weight is dedicated purely to food alone. Now, this totally reflects the reality that for a vast, impoverished segment of the population, just getting enough to eat is their absolute primary expense. But for the modern urban middle class, this weighting completely, totally distorts the economic reality they are actually living in every single day. Here is exactly where the disconnect becomes painfully obvious. In the official CPI, the price of onions is given massive, heavy importance because, let's face it, food price spikes can cause huge political backlash. But on the flip side, things like a 15% annual hike in your child's school fees or a sudden, staggering hospital bill are severely underrepresented in that same index. In fact, until very recently, massive everyday expenses like diagnostic medical services, which is literally a $15 billion market, weren't even included in the inflation calculation. The index is essentially tracking basic survival. It is not tracking modern living. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most painful reality of all. Let's look at how all these macro problems collide right on your doorstep. In part 4, the real estate trap, a fading dream. All of these foundational issues lead experts to this incredibly sobering conclusion. Most Indians will never be able to own a home. The old school idea that a salaried worker can just diligently save up some money and buy a house is rapidly becoming a literal mathematical impossibility in major urban centers. To see why, you just have to look at what is actually being built right now. According to recent market data, only a measly 12% of the new housing supply hitting the market is even categorized as affordable housing. Meanwhile, a massive 50% of all new supply is luxury housing, priced well above 1.5 crore. Developers are simply flat out not building homes for the average salary earner because the underlying economics of the market have shifted entirely away from them. And this leads us to the ultimate, truly heartbreaking paradox of the Indian real estate market. Currently, there is an estimated shortage of 1.9 crore houses for people who genuinely just need a roof over their heads. Yet, at the exact same time, there are 2.07 crore fully constructed, ready-to-live-in homes sitting completely empty. Think about that for a second. How can a country have millions of essentially homeless people and millions of completely empty homes simultaneously? Well, the answer lies in where the money is actually coming from. Housing prices are just no longer tied to local salaries at all. Instead, they are being fueled by massive waves of external capital. First up, you have non-resident Indian remittances, which recently hit nearly $129 billion. A huge chunk of that is heavily parked right into Indian real estate as an investment. Second, and this is wild, despite demonetization, the actual cash in circulation in the economy doubled, going from 17 lakh crore to 34 lakh crore. A massive portion of this undocumented wealth needs a place to hide, and it's safely tucked away in luxury real estate. So what we get is this brutal, vicious cycle. Undocumented cash and massive foreign remittances need a safe haven, right? So they are deployed directly into real estate. Because these buyers are totally flush with cash, developers naturally cater exclusively to them, building more and more high-end luxury units. This massive influx of cash artificially inflates land and property prices across the entire region. And the end result? The local salaried earner, the person who relies entirely on taxable, fully documented income, is completely and totally priced out of the market. Homes have transformed from basic human necessities into isolated speculative investment vehicles. Which brings us to our final thought for today. If the actual foundational structures of an economy, from the health of its currency and its manufacturing base, all the way to its housing market, are mathematically misaligned with the earning power of its everyday citizens, then what exactly happens to the dream of the middle class? It's a really complex reality hidden neatly behind those booming GDP numbers. But understanding it, seeing past the facade, is the very first step toward demanding better, more sustainable economic solutions. Keep asking those hard questions, keep looking at the data, and we will catch you in the next explainer.